Hi, so I can't figure out my audio, so I'm going to send this video in there and hope that this works. Hello, my name is Emily Linares, and for my biology slideshow, I will be discussing Chapter 4, Section 2 and 3 in our book. Overview. This is an overview of what I will be talking about in my presentation: the plasma membrane, the structure of the plasma membrane, and the fluid mosaic model. I will also be discussing the 6 functions of the membrane proteins, the cell theory, and lastly, the prokaryotic cell. The plasma membrane. All cells have it, the wall that blocks the outside world from coming in. The first slide, I will be discussing the plasma membrane. All cells have this. The function of the plasma membrane is to keep the outside world from coming in, and it keeps whatever is in there from coming out. Without the plasma membrane, there would be no regulating the passage of ions and molecules in and out of the cell. There are many different parts of the plasma membrane. The first I will be talking about is the phospholipid bilayer. This layer has many proteins embedded into it. If you look at my visual aid, you will see the phospholipid protein in the left-hand corner. A few of the other parts of the plasma membrane include the carbohydrate chain, the glycoprotein, and the hydrophilic and hydrophobic head and tail of the phospholipid. On my next slide, I will be discussing more in depth on the phospholipids. Structure. On this slide, I will be discussing the structure of the phospholipids. These lipids consist of a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail. As you can see in my picture, the hydrophobic tail points towards each other, whereas the hydrophobic head directs to the interior cytoplasm. In the space between the hydrophobic and hydrophobic head and tail, there is no water at all. Fluid mosaic model. On this slide, I will be discussing the fluid mosaic model. You may be asking why I use the word mosaic. They use the term mosaic because the protein molecules embedded in the membrane have a pattern very similar to that of a mosaic. I did also include my first picture, which is an actual mosaic, not one of a cell, to help connect our learning to the real world items we encounter. The illustration is an in-depth look on the fluid mosaic model. On this slide, I will be discussing a channel protein, the functions of the membrane proteins. These proteins form a tunnel-like area. By doing this, they allow only certain molecules to move slowly. A good example of this function is located in our textbook. This is aquaporins, channel proteins that allow water to enter or exit the cell. Without this function, your body will dehydrate quickly. Transport functions. On this slide, I will be discussing the transport protein. This function involves the protein of ion and molecules combined with other substances. It is also common for them to combine with other substances to allow this to move more easily through the membrane. I also included a question. This question was, what would be impossible without this function? The answer is nerve conduction. Cell recognition. This slide is all about cell recognition. I included a picture of a facial recognition. I felt this picture related a lot to what this function does. These cells are given glycoproteins. This function does so much for our body. They help us distinguish between good cells and bad cells in our body. If we didn't have this function, we would be sick a lot. I felt that facial recognition was very similar to how cell recognition works. Receptors. On the slide, I will be talking about receptor proteins. This protein has very specific shape. This shape allows very specific molecules to bind to it. The specific name for these types of molecules are called signal molecules. After the signal molecules bind to the receptor, it causes this receptor protein to change its shape. This then results in a cellular response. An example in our textbook is the insulin hormone will bind to a receptor protein in liver cells. Then after this cell stores glucose. The image that I provided on this slide helped visualize the idea of signal proteins in the receptor. I also included a fun true or false question. Do signal molecules bind to receptor protein? The answer, true. Enzymatic. This slide will be discussing the enzymatic protein. These proteins participate in metabolic reactions. Without this function, the cell membrane could never perform synthetic and degradative reactions. I included a helpful drawing that helps illustrate and explain the functions of the enzymatic protein. Junction protein. This slide will be talking about the junction protein. This function allows cells to adhere to each other. A good example of this is describing how our bladder works. The junction adhesion in the bladder will help keep the cells bound together as the bladder swells with urine. I included an image of a chain because it reminds me a lot of how the junction protein works. The cells adhere to each other similarly like the junction proteins adhere. Cell theory. The cell theory is a very important part of biology. This theory states that the basic unit of life that they come from pre-existing cells. Scientists have all agreed on a few characteristics of cells. These 3 characteristics are common among all cells. They all contain a plasma membrane made of phospholipids. These regulate the material that move outside and inside the cell. The second is they all contain cytoplasm. This is where all chemical actions will occur. Lastly, they contain DNA. This provides the info that is needed for cellular activities, reproduction, and lastly, the growth of a cell. I also included a fun pun on the slide to help liven up the presentation. prokaryotic. In this chapter, I will mostly be discussing the prokaryotic cell and not the eukaryotic cell. This type of cell is discussed more in the next section. This cell came roughly 3.5 billion years ago. These were the first cells on Earth. They are classified domain archaea or bacteria. Due to the size of prokaryotic cells, they can reproduce very fast. The large majority amount of prokaryotic cells are bacteria. A lot of people think all bacteria is bad when in reality, is the biosphere relies on bacteria, and so do our bodies. Yes, some bacteria is bad, but a lot helps our bodies function. For example, they run your intestines. The image to the right of the screen shows all the parts of the prokaryotic cell, but on my next slide, I have included a very informative video. True or false, prokaryotic cells have a membrane-bound nucleus? The answer is false. They do not contain a membrane-bound nucleus. I have included a very informational video. It does say it is for kids, but I found it really helpful in explaining the parts of the prokaryotic cell. I've added this slide to test your knowledge in what I've just discussed in my presentation. Question 1, name one characteristic all cells share according to the cell theory. The answer is found on slide 12. Question 2, how many functions does the cell membrane have? The answer, 6. Question 3, what are the majority of prokaryotic cells? The answer is bacteria. Question 4, what direction do hydrophobic tails face? The answer is they face towards each other. This concludes my presentation. I hope you learned some new things, and I'm working to get my narration, but I tried for a couple days and my computer's having issues, so I hope this works for now. Thank you.